The Pacific Night, 1943. Somewhere east of Truk Lagoon, a Japanese submarine drifts in near total darkness, its hull gliding through a cold, endless silence. Inside, the air is heavy, a faint hum of diesel engines, the soft click of valves, the rhythmic drip of condensation from the ceiling. The men are calm. They've done this 100 times. To them, American sonar is clumsy, a crude device that sends foolish pings into the ocean, easily fooled by silence and depth. The captain whispers a command. "Engines, stop." The hum dies. The world becomes still. Only the pulse of the ocean remains. Then what a sound. A single sharper ping, followed by another, and another. Each one closer, cleaner, more precise. The crew exchange looks. The calm turns brittle. The first depth charge hits the water. A pause. Then a thunderous bloom of pressure tears through the silence. The submarine shakes. Lights flicker. Metal groans. What the Japanese never realized was that the Americans had learned and adapted faster than anyone expected. In the early months of the Pacific War, the ocean belonged to Japan. From the first strikes on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 to the sweeping offensives across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, appeared unstoppable. Their submarines, sleek and long-ranged, prowled the seas with precision. They were designed for blue water warfare, fast, deep-diving, capable of reaching the distant coasts of Australia and even the American mainland. The Japanese submariners carried with them a sense of invincibility. They believed in stealth, discipline, and technological superiority. In their minds, the ocean was their ally, an endless, concealing expanse. Their doctrine wasn't built around hunting merchant ships like the German U-boats, but rather striking at enemy warships, ambushing fleets, and crippling logistics before battles even began. To the Japanese, American anti-submarine warfare was a joke. Early in the war, that perception wasn't far from the truth. The U.S. Navy's sonar systems, still known by their British name ASDIC, were unreliable, their operators inexperienced. Many believed sonar pings were too easily scattered or absorbed by thermoclines, layers of water temperature that bent sound waves unpredictably. Destroyer crews often chased phantom echoes or missed real ones entirely. Depth charges, too, were crude. Most were set too shallow, exploding harmlessly above their targets. American ships often dropped dozens, even hundreds, without scoring a single confirmed kill. Reports from 1942 described entire Japanese convoys slipping past U.S. escorts untouched. Meanwhile, the Japanese continued to strike. Submarines like I-19 and I-26 sank aircraft carriers and cruisers with audacious precision. Each success reinforced the myth of superiority. The officers aboard those steel tubes believed the Americans lacked both the nerve and the science to fight below the waves. But beneath that arrogance, something was shifting. Every failed patrol, every missed contact, and every lost convoy became a lesson for the Americans. Sonar scientists in San Diego and Pearl Harbor worked tirelessly, experimenting with new frequencies, training programs, and tactics. British experts shared their Atlantic experience, introducing ideas that would soon revolutionize Pacific warfare. By late 1942, subtle improvements began to appear. Destroyers received upgraded sonar heads capable of longer ranges and finer detection angles. Crews were trained to interpret faint echoes, distinguishing between whales, debris, and submarines. The Americans also began integrating radar and radio intelligence, using surface data to guide underwater hunts. For the Japanese, these developments went largely unnoticed. Their doctrine was slow to evolve. Commanders believed discipline and patience could defeat any machine. "The ocean is our camouflage," one officer reportedly said. No machine can see through it. But the ocean had started to betray them. The Americans were learning to listen differently, not for what they expected to hear, but for what the sea concealed. And beneath the calm blue expanse of the Pacific, a new kind of war was taking shape. One fought not with eyes or guns, but with sound. By the end of 1942, the balance had begun to shift. Destroyers that once chased ghosts were now beginning to strike real targets. Japanese crews noticed the difference. The pings were cleaner, the pursuers more relentless. Still, most dismissed it as luck. They laughed quietly in the dark, unaware that those echoes marked the beginning of the end for Japan's silent hunters. Because by 1942, under the waves of the Pacific, silence was no longer safety. By 1943, the undersea war in the Pacific had transformed from a guessing game into a calculated pursuit. What began as frantic blind hunts now became systematic operations, guided by technology, mathematics, and discipline. At the heart of this transformation was ASDIC, soon to be known simply as Sonar, sound navigation and ranging. The Americans, working from British templates refined in the Atlantic, began to perfect the art of listening through the sea. Every ping, once a crude burst of sound, became data. Trained operators could now interpret return echoes with astonishing accuracy, reading not just direction, but speed and depth. New models such as the QHB sonar set introduced fine-tuned frequency control, allowing ships to track a moving submarine even while maneuvering. This changed everything. Destroyers and destroyer escorts, once scattered and confused, were now organized into hunter-killer groups. Each operated like a hunting pack, coordinated by radio, radar, and shared sonar data. When one ship made contact, others moved to triangulate, boxing the submarine in from multiple angles. The ocean, once the Submariner's shield, became a trap of sound. Depth charges evolved too. Early models detonated at set depths, often missing as submarines dived deeper or changed course. By mid-1943, hydrostatic fuses were recalibrated, capable of reaching depths of 600 feet or more. Later came Hedgehog launchers, forward-firing mortars that lobbed multiple small charges ahead of the ship. Unlike traditional depth charges, Hedgehog rounds exploded only on contact, signaling a direct hit instantly. To a submarine commander, the difference was terrifying. The old rhythm, ping, pause, explosion, silence, was replaced by a rapid, continuous barrage. The Americans no longer searched in desperation. They attacked with precision. Behind these advances was a massive industrial effort. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and naval officers across the United States worked tirelessly to refine every component: transducers, amplifiers, hydrophones, and recording instruments. New training centers were established, most notably at Key West and San Diego, where sonar operators drilled for hours in darkened rooms, listening to tapes of simulated contacts until they could recognize the faintest echo of a submerged propeller. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, lessons learned against German U-boats poured into the Pacific command structure. American destroyer captains adopted convoy escort tactics, integrating air patrols and radar sweeps. Patrol bombers with magnetic anomaly detectors began coordinating with surface fleets, forcing Japanese submarines to submerge earlier, where sonar could find them more easily. For Japan, the changes were invisible until it was too late. The Imperial Navy still viewed submarines as strategic tools, not tactical weapons. They were designed for long-range strikes, not convoy defense. Their sonar technology lagged far behind. Many Japanese submarines lacked even basic underwater detection equipment. Crews relied almost entirely on periscopes, instincts, and silence. But silence was no longer enough. The Americans could now track the faint sound of a turning propeller or a shifting ballast tank. Submarines that once waited patiently in ambush found themselves stalked by destroyers that seemed to know exactly where they were and where they were heading. One Japanese report from late 1943 described it bitterly. The enemy no longer searches blindly. They hear us breathe. The ocean had become an acoustic battlefield, invisible yet deadly precise. This transformation wasn't just technological, it was psychological. For every American sonar operator who learned to trust the instruments, there was a Japanese submariner realizing that the sea, once their domain, was no longer theirs. By late 1943, the Americans had turned sound into a weapon, and so began a hidden war beneath the ocean's skin, where technology and patience would decide survival. The Americans had always been engineers first, sailors second. Their strength was not just in courage, but in adaptation. The early sonar sets of 1941 could barely distinguish a submarine from a school of fish, but by 1943, laboratories at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington and the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory were decoding the very language of the sea. They learned how sound curved through layers of temperature, how it refracted off the seafloor, and how even the echo of a ship's screw could tell a story. The breakthrough came when American scientists began using frequency analysis, measuring how different materials reflected sound. Submarines produced sharper, more consistent returns than rock or coral. This allowed sonar operators to read the sea like a radar screen, identifying shape, depth, and sometimes even hull size. Every destroyer became an ear pressed to the deep. The ocean, once infinite and unknowable, began to reveal its secrets. By contrast, Japanese engineers remained bound by pre-war doctrines. Their sonar sets, typically the Type 93 and Type 95 models, had limited range and poor resolution. They were designed mainly for self-defense, not pursuit. The Imperial Navy invested more in torpedoes and long-range attack submarines than in underwater detection. This imbalance became deadly. By the time the Japanese realized how far sonar had advanced, American ships were hunting them with a precision they had never imagined possible. The invisible weapon and sound had changed the war. Technology may have shifted the odds, but inside those submarines, war was still fought by human nerves. Aboard a Japanese submarine in 1943, the conditions were brutal. Space was scarce, humidity constant, and the air stifling. Diesel fumes mingled with sweat and oil. There was little room for rest. Bunks were shared in shifts, meals eaten quickly in silence. The Japanese submariners were among the most disciplined sailors in the world. Their training emphasized stoicism and endurance, the ability to remain still for hours while destroyers combed the water above. They trusted their commanders implicitly and believed that the emperor watched their courage even from beneath the waves. But that faith was tested. When American sonar pings began to grow sharper and closer, crews learned a new kind of fear, one that could not be fought, only endured. Every sound, a dropped wrench, a whispered order, even the crack of a valve, might betray them. Men learned to breathe through cloth, to move only when necessary. The silence was not peace. It was a sentence. For the Americans, life aboard the surface ships was no easier. Sonar operators sat for hours in dark, humming rooms wearing heavy headphones, listening for faint echoes through static and mechanical noise. One veteran later recalled, "You learned the sea's heartbeat, and when it changed, you knew something was down there." Mistakes were costly. False echoes could waste hours and hundreds of depth charges. The strain was constant. Sleep was light. The line between sound and imagination blurred. Yet the operators learned discipline, to trust data over instinct, to wait for the exact echo before ordering an attack. Each confirmed kill was not a victory of aggression, but of patience. And in that patience, the Americans found mastery. Tactically, the undersea war evolved into an art of geometry and timing. Early in the war, destroyers hunted alone, sweeping wide arcs and dropping charges by guesswork. But by mid-1943, American naval doctrine had shifted. Now multiple destroyers worked together, forming a ring of sound. When one ship's sonar made contact, others would move to flank, adjusting position to triangulate the submarine's bearing and speed. The contact's depth was plotted through time and sound delay, a process so refined that a good operator could predict where the submarine would be seconds ahead. Once cornered, the attack began. Depth charges were set at staggered depths, shallow, mid, and deep, creating a descending wall of explosions. Each detonation reshaped the ocean around the target, crushing hulls or driving the submarine into deeper water, where the oxygen thinned and the noise of its escape gave it away. The Japanese responded by diving deeper and slower, sometimes resting on the seabed to mask their presence. But sonar could now detect even stationary contacts, reading the echo difference between steel and sand. It was no longer a contest of hiding. It was a race against time. Destroyer escorts became specialists in this silent war. Ships like the USS England would go on to sink 6 Japanese submarines in just 12 days, all guided by sonar. The ocean that once favored stealth now punished it. Yet even as the Americans grew more precise, the Japanese relied on silence, and silence became a trap. Every successful sonar contact began with intelligence, and by 1943, the Americans had turned information into a weapon as sharp as any torpedo. While Japan relied on radio silence and predictable patrol routes, the Allies were learning to think like mathematicians. Through the Magic Code-breaking program, U.S. intelligence began intercepting Japanese naval communications, identifying where submarines would patrol, refuel, and regroup. These decrypted transmissions were quietly passed to anti-submarine task forces, allowing destroyers and aircraft to lie in wait. The ocean no longer felt random. It was mapped by knowledge. In many cases, sonar wasn't the first clue. It was the final confirmation. U.S. destroyer groups, guided by ultra-intercepts or radar sightings, would converge on a grid square already suspected to hide an enemy sub. Once there, sonar painted the finishing picture. For the Japanese, this invisible hand of intelligence was impossible to detect. Crews believed their luck had turned, not realizing that every move they made was being read by unseen ears thousands of miles away. The Americans had combined signals intelligence, acoustic detection, and surface coordination into one seamless system. The war beneath the sea was no longer fought by instinct. It was managed by science. War beneath the sea depended on what happened far above it, in the roaring factories of America. By 1943, the U.S. Navy had become a machine of production unlike anything in history. Every week brought new destroyers, escort carriers, sonar sets, and aircraft fitted with radar and detection gear. The industrial scale of this output dwarfed anything the Japanese Empire could produce. In Massachusetts and California, assembly lines built sonar transducers by the thousands. Precision instruments turned out faster than Japan could build submarines. Each destroyer escort rolled from the shipyards armed with depth charges, hedgehog mortars, and the latest sonar gear, ready to join the endless Atlantic and Pacific convoys. This relentless production gave the Americans something the Japanese never had: redundancy. If one ship fell, 3 more replaced it. If a sonar system failed, replacements were already waiting at Pearl Harbor. Japan, constrained by limited raw materials and an overstretched empire, simply could not keep pace. Oil shortages crippled training schedules. Submarine crews often went to sea with minimal practice. Some vessels lacked spare parts for even basic maintenance. The Americans, on the other hand, refined their technology faster than the Japanese could study it. Each month, new sonar models with improved range and precision reached the fleet. Manuals were updated, training programs revised, tactics rewritten, a living, breathing system of constant improvement. By 1944, Japanese submariners described their opponents as omniscient. They couldn't comprehend how American ships always seemed to appear where they least expected. But the answer was simple. America's war machine was listening, learning, and never stopping. It wasn't just a contest of ships, it was a contest of systems. And in that contest, Japan never stood a chance. For the Japanese High Command, accepting defeat beneath the waves was unthinkable. The Imperial Navy's culture was steeped in the traditions of honor and faith. Victory was expected, failure unspoken. Reports of submarine losses were often softened, and warnings about the enemy's new technology went unheeded. Admirals who suggested a change in doctrine, shifting submarines from offensive to defensive roles, were quietly sidelined. This pride, forged in pre-war victories, blinded leadership to the changing nature of the conflict. The same commanders who once believed in the battleship's supremacy now dismissed the significance of sonar and mass production. They saw warfare as an art of spirit, not science. Meanwhile, American commanders like Admiral Ernest King and Chester Nimitz, both former submariners themselves, recognized the ocean as a field of information. They prioritized communication between scientists and sailors, ensuring that every technological advance reached the fleet rapidly. The cultural contrast was stark. Japanese submariners were taught to die with honor. American sonar operators were taught to adapt and survive. By late 1944, whispers began spreading through the Japanese fleet. Stories of submarines that vanished without sending a single message, of destroyers that hunted relentlessly in perfect silence. Some crews went to sea knowing they might never return. Still, the command insisted on more patrols, more attacks, more sacrifice. It was as if pride itself had become a weapon, one turned inward. When the tide of war finally shifted on the surface, when at Leyte Gulf at the Philippine Sea, Japan's undersea force had already been crippled. Fewer than a third of their submarines remained. The laughter that once echoed in steel corridors at the mention of American sonar had long since died. By 1944, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield, it was a sonar field. By early 1944, the silent war beneath the Pacific had reached its critical point. American sonar was no longer experimental, it was lethal. Destroyers moved with the calm assurance of predators that knew their prey could not hide. The Japanese submarines, once symbols of stealth and reach, were now ghosts being chased by mathematics. The shift was visible across the ocean. From the Solomon Islands to the Philippine Sea, American destroyer escorts patrolled in coordinated packs. Each carried its own sonar suite, hedgehog launchers, and radar. all connected by disciplined communication. One of the most decisive episodes came in May 1944, when a small U.S. escort group set out from the Admiralty Islands. Their mission? Hunt down a group of Japanese submarines reported to be shadowing Allied convoys en route to the Marianas. Among those destroyer escorts was a ship whose name would become legend, USS England, DE-635. The England was not a battleship nor a cruiser, but a modest destroyer escort, one of hundreds built to defend convoys. Her crew was young, many barely out of training, but they carried something the Japanese underestimated: confidence in sound. On May 18, 1944, the England sonar operator picked up a faint echo, barely perceptible deep beneath the waves. The contact held steady. It was real. Captain Walton Pendleton ordered an attack run. The ship maneuvered silently into position as the sonar pings grew stronger. The bearing shifted. The submarine was moving. "Fire, Hedgehog!" 24 small charges arced into the sea, descending in a tight spread. Seconds later, a single explosion. Then another. Then a violent underwater roar that rolled through the ship's hull. Contact lost. Then oil rising to the surface. The first kill, Japanese submarine I-16, destroyed within minutes. It was a victory, but not an anomaly. Over the next 12 days, the USS England would sink 5 more submarines: RO-106, RO-104, RO-116, RO-108, and RO-105, each found by sonar, each destroyed with precise Hedgehog attacks. 6 submarines in 12 days. No other warship in history had done the same. Japanese commanders were stunned. Their reports spoke of an unseen enemy that hunts with perfect direction. They could not comprehend how American ships were finding them so quickly. The truth was simple. Every ping, every echo, every small adjustment in sonar frequency brought the destroyers closer. These weren't blind attacks. They were acoustic executions. At night, the ocean around the Marianas flickered with flashes of depth-charge blasts. Survivors described the pressure waves that tore through steel bulkheads, the sensation of lungs collapsing, the desperate scramble to seal hatches as water poured in. Few lived to tell those stories. To the men on the England and her sister ships, it was work, intense, exhausting, but methodical. Each attack was timed to fractions of a second. Each kill was confirmed by sonar silence. When the last echo faded, the operator would whisper, "Contact lost, target destroyed." Word of the England's success spread across the Pacific Fleet. Sailors began to call her the submarine slayer. But she was not alone. Across the Pacific, similar victories multiplied. Destroyer escorts from Task Force 74 and 75 hunted relentlessly, their sonar systems guided by both intelligence and instinct. By mid-1944, the Japanese submarine arm was reeling. The once proud offensive fleet that had struck fear into the Allies was now being decimated faster than it could be replaced. Submarines sent to supply isolated garrisons never arrived. Commanders who left port vanished without a trace. The sonar ping, once mocked by Japanese crews, had become a sound of dread. A metallic heartbeat that promised death. Every pulse of sound marked the Americans' growing dominance. A symphony of vengeance beneath the sea. As the USS England and her sister ships returned to port, their hulls scarred but intact, the message was clear. The silent ocean no longer belonged to Japan. One by one, the echoes faded, not from the sonar but from the depths themselves. By the summer of 1944, Japan's submarine fleet was fighting a war it could no longer win, or even understand. The Pacific had become an ocean of sound. Every Allied convoy was shielded by sonar-equipped escorts. Every Japanese submarine that ventured near was hunted by unseen ears long before it ever saw its prey. The Imperial Navy still clung to hope. New submarines were launched, some equipped with improved torpedoes and marginally faster dive speeds. But the truth was inescapable. The Americans had achieved acoustic dominance. At the heart of this dominance lay not just sonar, but coordination. The Americans had fused radar, sonar, radio intelligence, and air reconnaissance into a seamless detection web. Submarines were caught at every stage of operation, leaving port, approaching convoys, or even during refueling. In late 1944, as the campaign for the Philippines intensified, the Japanese deployed their submarines desperately to intercept Allied invasion fleets. What followed was a massacre. Off Leyte Gulf, American destroyer escorts swept the approaches day and night. When sonar ping struck steel, depth charges followed within seconds. Reports from U.S. Task Force 77 describe dozens of sonar contacts, many fleeting, some faint, but each chased until silence returned. The USS Whitehurst, USS Raby, and USS George all scored confirmed kills within weeks, guided by sonar that could now maintain contact even through the turbulence of exploding charges, a capability unheard of only a year earlier. Beneath the waves, the experience for Japanese crews was apocalyptic. Submariners described the world closing in, the pings echoing through the hull like a heartbeat counting down to death. When depth charges detonated nearby, the pressure would bend steel plates, extinguish lights, and hurl men across compartments. Instruments shattered, air grew toxic, and the temperature rose until breathing burned. There was no escape, no countermeasure, only silence and waiting. The American sonar operators, meanwhile, worked with precision bordering on ritual. Sitting in dark rooms lit only by green indicator lights, they listened for faint changes in echo tone, the difference between a living target and a wreck. When the echo grew erratic, they knew the submarine was turning. When it faded, they knew it was diving. And when it disappeared abruptly, leaving behind a single soft reflection of debris, they knew it was over. By early 1945, Japan's submarine fleet had lost nearly 130 boats, many with all hands. The ocean had become a graveyard. Each new loss carried a deeper meaning. The Imperial Navy's ability to strike behind enemy lines vanished. Convoy escorts could now move freely. The shipping lanes from California to the Philippines, once perilous, became highways of unstoppable logistics. Japan's naval command, desperate for results, tried to shift tactics, using submarines for supply missions to isolated garrisons and even suicide attacks. But these efforts met the same fate. Sonar-equipped destroyers intercepted most before they reached their targets. In April 1945, during the final months of the Pacific War, one last technological duel unfolded off Okinawa. American forces, preparing for the massive invasion, maintained a constant sonar screen. Dozens of destroyers spaced miles apart, each monitoring overlapping acoustic zones. Japanese submarines ordered to attack the invasion fleet were annihilated before they could fire. Among them was I-361, sunk on May 31, 1945 by the destroyer escort USS Anzio and its hunter group. The attack lasted less than 20 minutes. Sonar contact, hedgehog strike, explosion, then nothing. The Americans had perfected the process to the point of routine. The war beneath the waves had become industrialized, not in numbers of ships, but in precision and predictability. For the men inside Japan's submarines, the fear was no longer of being found. It was the certainty of being found. Every ping that echoed through the steel hull meant that somewhere above someone was listening and closing in. There were no more jokes about American sonar, no more laughter in the cramped, diesel-scented quarters, only silence broken by the metallic heartbeat that had become the sound of their defeat. By the war's end, Japan's submarine service was functionally extinct. Of the nearly 200 operational submarines it had launched during the conflict, over 130 were lost, many without survivors. Entire flotillas vanished. Admirals stopped asking for after-action reports. There were none. The Americans had turned sonar from a tool into a doctrine, and in doing so reshaped the future of naval warfare. The ocean itself seemed to remember. Long after the explosions faded, the seabed of the Pacific was littered with steel coffins, the remnants of a fleet that once believed the sea would protect it. The Americans had mastered the invisible war, and the ocean remembered their sound. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the war beneath the Pacific had already ended months before. Japan's submarine fleet, once a proud secretive arm of the Imperial Navy, was gone. Not defeated in battle, but methodically erased. American records after VJ Day painted a grim picture. Of the 192 Japanese submarines commissioned during the war, over 130 had been sunk. Another 20 were scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. Dozens more were trapped in ports rusting in silence under Allied occupation. Each loss represented not just a ship but a crew, typically between 80 and 100 men. Most never resurfaced. In the years that followed, Japanese historians estimated that nearly 12,000 submariners were lost at sea, entombed in the cold depths of the Pacific. The survival rate was barely 15%, one of the lowest of any service branch in any nation during the war. For the Americans, the shift was visible even before 1945. Allied shipping losses to Japanese submarines had fallen to almost zero by late 1944. Convoys that once required elaborate evasive routes now sailed directly across the ocean with minimal interference. What had once been a terrifying underwater menace became a statistical footnote. But beneath those numbers lay something deeper, a story of adaptation. The United States Navy had started the war with fragile, uncertain technology. In 1941, sonar was still an experimental tool, unreliable in deep water, confused by temperature layers and plagued by false echoes. By 1945, it had evolved into an integrated combat system capable of detecting, tracking, and destroying targets invisible to the human eye. The journey from crude beginnings to lethal precision wasn't accidental. It was the result of relentless learning. Every depth charge dropped, every contact lost, every survivor's report, and all were studied. Patterns were mapped, weaknesses corrected. The Navy's sonar schools trained thousands of operators to interpret subtle acoustic cues. Engineers refined transducer designs, amplifier circuits, and signal processing. The enemy had forced them to evolve, and they did, faster than anyone expected. In contrast, Japan's naval doctrine froze in time. Even as their submarines vanished, command believed that the cause was poor luck or crew error, not technological inferiority. The few engineers who warned of Allied sonar advancements were often ignored or silenced. By the time countermeasures were seriously discussed, it was too late. Captured documents after the war revealed how far behind they truly were. Japanese sonar sets known as Type 93 and Type 3 were barely comparable to early war American models. They lacked fine frequency control, had weak power output, and couldn't distinguish between true echoes and background noise. Their range rarely exceeded 1,000 meters, while American QHB and QHBJ sets could detect contacts up to 3,000. That disparity turned the Pacific into a one-sided battlefield. Where the Japanese saw only darkness, the Americans heard everything. The transformation also altered naval strategy beyond the immediate war. The United States emerged from the conflict understanding that information, not armor or firepower, would define victory at sea. Sonar became the blueprint for all future detection systems, leading directly to Cold War innovations like passive hydrophone arrays and nuclear hunter-killers. But in 1945, none of that mattered to the men who had lived it. To American sailors, the victory felt clinical. A series of clean sonar traces, detonations, and confirmed kills. Few ever saw the faces of those they destroyed. To Japanese families, it was absence. Sons, brothers, and fathers who never came home. Letters unanswered. Graves that the ocean kept forever. In post-war Tokyo, a single bronze plaque would eventually be dedicated to the submariners of the Imperial Navy. The inscription read simply, "They went to sea and did not return." Yet their story was not just one of loss. It was a reminder of how quickly technological arrogance can collapse. The same laughter that once filled the steel corridors of Japan's submarines had vanished, replaced by the echo of the very sound they once mocked. The ocean had taught its lesson well, and that lesson now set the stage for a new era of naval warfare, an era of silence, sensors, and invisible weapons. When Allied investigators arrived in Japan after the surrender, they expected to find advanced undersea technology. The Imperial Navy, after all, had been among the first to develop long-range submarines and advanced torpedoes. But what they found instead was technological stagnation, a fleet that had fallen decades behind in the science of detection. In naval yards at Kure, Yokosuka, and Sasebo, American engineers examined captured equipment, sonar consoles, radio hydrophones, depth gauges. Most were crude copies of pre-war European models. Oscilloscopes used for signal interpretation were outdated. Cables were corroded. Documentation was incomplete. The Americans realized that Japan's submarine losses were not simply a result of Allied might, but of a profound failure to evolve. Post-war intelligence teams, including those from the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan, compiled reports that astonished even their own commanders. They discovered that Japanese sonar development had effectively stalled after 1941. The Imperial Navy scientists were isolated, underfunded, and hampered by a culture that valued secrecy over collaboration. The result was a system where breakthroughs never reached the fleet, and warnings from engineers were buried in bureaucracy. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy's success had been driven by the opposite philosophy. From Harvard's underwater sound laboratory to Bell Labs, American research was decentralized and open. Civilians worked alongside officers, exchanging data rapidly and refining sonar hardware through real-time feedback from combat operations. The war had proven that technology and information flow were inseparable. The Navy that listened best, both to the ocean and to its own scientists, would win. This realization carried forward into the early Cold War. As relations with the Soviet Union deteriorated, both superpowers began a new race beneath the sea, not for battleships or carriers, but for silence. The SOSUS network, a vast array of underwater microphones deployed by the U.S. Navy in the late 1940s, directly descended from wartime sonar research. The lessons learned against Japanese submarines shaped every aspect of it: frequency analysis, pattern recognition, and the human training required to hear meaning in noise. The Americans had discovered that war could be fought in sound space, a dimension invisible to radar, unseen by aircraft, but just as decisive. Japan, now under Allied occupation, had no navy left, but the surviving scientists quietly began to rebuild under American supervision, contributing their knowledge to civilian research. Decades later, when Japan re-established its maritime self-defense force, its sonar programs were built on American frameworks, a quiet continuation of the story that began in the dark Pacific of 1943. For historians, the post-war years revealed a deeper irony. The same Imperial Navy that had launched Pearl Harbor, an operation defined by stealth and surprise, had failed to grasp the essence of stealth beneath the sea. Their submarines could hide, but they could not listen. And in modern warfare, to not listen is to die unseen. The legacy of the sonar war also lived on in the people who fought it. Many American sonar operators, now old men in the 1960s and 70s, described their wartime work as a strange kind of intimacy. They never saw the enemy, only heard them. They remembered the pattern of propeller beats, the rise and fall of echoes, the moments before a submarine was destroyed. It was, as one veteran described, like hearing someone's heartbeat stop through the wall. For the Japanese, remembrance came quietly. Each year, families visited coastal shrines and threw flowers into the sea. There were no wreck recoveries, no bodies returned. The ocean remained the keeper of their memory, and still, even decades later, sonar traces occasionally revealed faint metallic shadows resting on the seabed, the remains of the submarines that once mocked the clumsy pings of the enemy. In those echoes, history seemed to whisper. The laughter that had once filled the hulls was gone, replaced by the hum of American innovation, the steady rhythm of sonar that had redefined war itself. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, had recorded it all. And as the Cold War began, every new submarine, Soviet, American, or Japanese, would carry a silent inheritance from that struggle. The war of sound had only begun. In the end, the war beneath the Pacific was not won by courage or firepower, but by understanding, by the ability to hear what others could not. The story of Japan's submariners and America's sonar was more than a clash of steel and explosions. It was the meeting of two kinds of thought, one clinging to tradition, the other evolving through failure. The Japanese believed silence was safety. The Americans learned that silence could speak. Every ping that echoed through the ocean was not just sound, it was knowledge made visible. It carried years of research, the fingerprints of engineers and the focus of young operators listening for something no human ear was ever meant to hear. And in that knowledge lay the future. The battle that began as a desperate duel for control of the Pacific became the foundation of a new kind of warfare, where machines no longer just fired weapons, but listened. Where information became as lethal as ammunition. Yet behind every sonar trace, every sinking, every explosion, there were men. Men who laughed in the dark, who trusted in silence, who believed they could outwit sound itself, and men who listened patiently in blackened rooms guided by faint echoes and cold precision. Both sides were bound by the same ocean. Both learned in different ways the same truth, that technology amplifies not only our strength but also our blindness. Today the seas remain quiet but not silent. Beneath the calm surface, submarines still glide, guided by descendants of those wartime machines. The technology has changed, but the echoes remain. The ocean still remembers the laughter, the fear, and the pings that once decided life and death. And somewhere in its depths the sound still travels, a faint reminder that in war as in life, the moment we stop listening is the moment we begin to sink.